Nice to meet with you. I am Chang-Yong Lee from the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries. I am very pleased to see that many people are interested in Green Corridor, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a presentation here in this conference. In the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, I am in charge of vessel survey and environment-related assessment. One of the biggest issues these days is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships, and implementing this idea has been very important at our ministry. The theme of this session is Green Corridor. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to briefly explain why the Korean government has pursued Green Corridor from last year. I would like to explain about the background and progress of our Green Corridor project. As you know very well, in 2018, IMO announced the initial GHG reduction strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. And in July this year, IMO came up with its renewed greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy to achieve net zero by 2050. It also announced indicative checkpoints for 2030 and 2040. And one of the most important elements in this 2023 strategy is that by 2030, from 5 to 10% of the fuels for vessels should be zero CO2 fuel or near zero carbon fuel. You might be very familiar with this chart. Compared to business as usual, we have to achieve net zero by 2050. If you look at this graph, you will see how much effort will be needed. By 2030, we could reduce greenhouse gas emission by 20%, but if you try to reduce this by 70 or 80% from 2040, you need totally innovative technologies along with alternative fuels. As you may know very well, IMO announced the regulations regarding EEDI, EEXI, and CII. By reducing energy consumption, we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for up to 30%. And if you look at the amended IMO GHG strategy, there were some countries or governments that were lack of preparation to achieve the target. So this mid-term measure will be taking into effect from 2027. The content is that we have to manage the carbon intensity index from ships, and we have to adopt economic measures. So technical element and economic element have been introduced as midterm measures under 2023 GHG strategy. IMO is having discussion regarding this. By the end of next year, they will propose the final idea for the midterm measures based on the opinions of the member countries, including the interim goals in order to achieve net zero by 2050. We have to realize this fact that just by relying on EEDI or EEXI, we cannot achieve the target. This is why we are looking at the possibility of alternative fuel or future fuel. First, under an assumption that we can use drop-in fuel, we're working with experts to see the feasibility of hydrogen, e-fuel, bio, and methanol and LNG. the Korean government began to consider and implement pilot projects on biofuel. So in 2023, our biofuel demonstration project will be completed. Also, we will complete methanol bunkering project by 2023. It is inevitable that we have to make fuel transition. The Korean government is working with the maritime and shipbuilding industries regarding the fuel transition, and the industries are asking the government to take the leading role in the fuel transition efforts. Among various future fuels, LNG, green methanol, biofuel, and green ammonia and green hydrogen are the most prominent candidates for future fuels in Korea. You will be familiar with technical information about these fuels, but to briefly explain, LNG is the most highly commercialized fuel, but we don't have complete supply chain for LNG, and we have limits in the effect of CO2 emission reduction when we use LNG. But recently, global shipping companies, including Musk, began to work on methanol. And methanol ships have been in service since 2015, but the possibility of methanol, green methanol, as an alternative fuel has increased further. As we understand, 46 methanol ship orders have been placed in 2022. It shows how important the methanol fuel is. In the case of biofuel, the current idea is that we will mix the bio-based fuel with fossil-based fuel. According to MEPC, the 80th MEPC meeting, there were the interim guidelines adopted for clarifying how certified sustainable biofuels can be used to improve the ship's CII rating. And this will be followed up on by the member countries at IMO. When IMO adopted the 2018 GHG reduction strategy, we focused on ammonia as a prominent alternative fuel for the future. From as early as next year, ammonia engine will be released. For now, compared to the potential of ammonia, the technology is not sufficiently mature. There are many types of alternative fuel, as you see here. Representative alternative fuels are the four fuels I have just explained, and there are also other types of alternatives, including LPG and electric propulsion fuel. In terms of fuel, bunker seal, bunker diesel, or other oil fuel will no longer be effective or feasible. From now on, you have to consider the characteristics of the alternative fuel as well as the availability of the alternative fuel. You also have to consider whether those alternative fuels will have impact on the health of your seafarers and crews. So we heard the feedback from the industries, and we found that the most important thing we have to consider is to ensure safety of seafarers who are going to deal with the alternative fuel. We have to ensure the health and safety of people on the ship. And it is important to be able to use the alternative fuel without risks compared to the way we use the fossil fuels. Ensuring safety is the most important one, and we have to ensure that the technology of the alternative fuel is mature enough. And shipping companies should consider CapEx and OpEx when they use alternative fuel for the vessels. They have to also consider the amount of cost they have to spend for alternative fuel operation. Even if you adopt alternative fuels, it depends. The situation could be different depending on which region you are navigating towards, whether it be Asian region, the US, or the other continent. Considering the destination or the route you're going to use, you will face a lot of variables you have to consider. So, which is the most proper alternative fuel? This question has always been raised and discussed among people in this industry, but we were not able to get a single answer because there are so many uncertainties. The Korean government wants to address such uncertainties, and the government should give clearer clues to the industries. This is why we analyze the needs and situation of the market. And I would like to explain about the things we consider that the Korean government for our policy. Not just the IMO's decarbonization policies, but also the decarbonization pressure for shipbuilding and marine industries have been growing these days. And in the next presentation, there will be further explanation about this content. But in the EU, new regulations like ETS and Fuel EU Maritime will take into force from 2024. And if you don't take any measure, and if you arrive at the port of the EU, then shipping companies will have to bear a huge amount of cost, although I'm not going to mention the specific amount of money. And private sector, the government and academia should come together to discuss what kind of technologies they have to develop for decarbonization in the maritime sector. And they also need to discuss the priority of decarbonization technologies along with the necessary regulations and policies. And such discussion is currently going on in Korea. For example, such discussion is going on, and one of the example is getting to zero 2030 collision and mission innovation and zero emission shipping mission. Also in June 2023, we made Seoul Declaration. Besides these, there are many decarbonization initiatives that are going on in Korea. All these initiatives are focusing on how we can accelerate the fuel transition and who is going to take the lead in making fuel transition. In May this year, considering the progress at the IMO and in the industry, we announced the decarbonization strategy for international shipping. The vision is to achieve net zero by 2050. For this vision, we have 4 strategies. First strategy is to make transition to eco-friendly fleets, and on the right side you see the target number of vessels. 867 vessels will have to transition to eco-friendly fleets by 2050. This is included in our plan. and relevant regulations and laws will be improved according to this vision. And secondly, in order to institutionalize the eco-friendly fuel adoption, we need improvement in the investment environment, including government-funded funding initiatives. We have to activate the private sector's investment in this area. The private sector here includes the banking sector. We also need to target zero carbon or low carbon technologies so that we can develop technologies that could innovate the entire life cycle of the vessels. And the strategies number 1, 2, and 3 here require a lot of time and efforts. But as I mentioned before, we have to think about how we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And we have to demonstrate the zero emission routes and enforce international cooperation. And Korean government needs to take the leading role in these strategy implementation. Green shipping corridor is not just about creating a low carbon or zero carbon route between one port and another. It includes greening the infrastructure and decarbonization across the relevant infrastructure around the ports. And the cargo loaded on the vessels will face higher freight once this green corridor is fully implemented, but the true decarbonization should be achieved through the green shipping corridor. Last year in Egypt, the 27th COP meeting was held, and Korea and the US announced collaboration on green shipping corridor. And we had a discussion about how these two countries will establish green corridor. From February this year, we began the feasibility study, which will be completed and reported by November this year. We have come up with a draft result report, and we are discussing with the US on how we're going to further develop this study. We have 4 categories of joint research done by Korean and American experts. For example, we have studied how we can establish port infrastructure. And we have also discussed whether we can develop and establish infrastructure to deal with alternative fuel. We have also discussed the amount of cargo that will be loaded on the vessels with going through the green shipping corridor. We're also reviewing relevant policy and regulations and fundings. So we have gathered our opinions. Between Korea and the US, green shipping corridor means a lot more than you see here on surface. For example, we reached a consensus on establishing green shipping corridor between the two countries' ports, and we thoroughly reviewed the port conditions and infrastructure of the port in order to choose the best option. And the green shipping corridor between Korea and the US is a bit different from other countries' green shipping corridor because the Korean government and the US government have strong commitment to this idea, and it has a top-down approach. In order to shorten the time taken for preparation, we selected Busan, Masan, and Ulsan ports and Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma ports of the US as a candidate for green corridor ports. As you see on the slide, we gathered the preliminary data from the ports regarding their potential, and we guess that from 2025 we will be able to enable bunkering. As mentioned before, the Korean government and the US government have been going through green shipping corridor by using various strategies which are a bit different from other green corridor projects. The first thing is that this is government-led green shipping corridor, and the Korea-US green shipping corridor would be probably the first green shipping corridor that is led by the government side. These are what we have to do for the future. In order to conduct pilot operation of the green shipping corridor from 2027, we have to further develop the feasibility study and create a consortium including each country's stakeholders, and we will demonstrate and operate green shipping corridor. And even before we begin the pilot routes between Korea and the US, we plan to increase the green shipping corridor between Korea and other countries, including Australia and Singapore. So we hope that our pilot project or model of green shipping corridor could serve as a best practice or as a role model for other green shipping corridor projects of the world. Thank you very much for your attention.